Aloha and welcome. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about loops in general. A loop is essentially a construct that allows you to repeat a block of code, what we call the loop body, over and over and over. It's going to do that while a certain condition is true. As soon as that condition is no longer true, you'll exit out of that loop body, and you'll start executing at the next line of code. So you'll loop over and over while this condition is true. Then you'll exit out right under the code, line by line. So this process of going through these loops over and over, it's called iterating. And we talk about one path through that loop body as being an iteration. So I'm going to show you some examples here. So hold on, and I will pull up my VS Code screen. So here we can see some examples that they talk about in the book. And what I've done here is I've gone ahead and pseudocoded everything. So the first example that we have is the example of the average function. So to get the average, what we're going to do is we're going to start out, our count is going to be 0, our sum is going to be 0, and our average is going to be 0. So we set up everything, we initialize everything, and then what we're going to do is we're going to start inputting numbers. We're going to ask the user to, hey, tell us a number. Then we're going to take that number and we're going to test and we're going to say, hey, is this number given to us 0? If it is 0, we're going to exit out. We call this a sentinel value, but it'll kick out essentially if they give us a 0. If it's not a 0, if it's a positive number, what we're going to do at that point is we're going to enter this loop, and in the loop we're going to increase our counter by 1. We're going to add the sum that we have, the going sum. We're going to add to it the number that we just input. And then we're going to calculate the average as the number of things that we've inputted. Or actually, we're going to take the sum and we're going to divide it by the number of things that we've inputted. So that's why we're keeping track in every loop here in the loop body. We're keeping track of the count. We're adding 1 to it, and we're adding the number that we input into our sum. And then with those two pieces of information, in other words, the number of numbers that we have here, as well as the sum of those numbers, then we can calculate the average. So technically this last line, the average, the sum of divided by count, we can do that actually after we finish and we get that 0 and we exit out. Then we could do something like average it and then give a result and tell the reader what the actual average was. So what we're doing again, we're just looping over and over until we get a 0. And you'll hear about this in the future, but that exit condition where we exit when something is false or whatever, here we're waiting until we'll do a loop over something until the input is 0. But that 0 that we're waiting for is the sentinel value. So we're going to loop over. We're going to do the count equals count plus 1. We're going to do the sum equals sum plus the input number. And then as soon as they enter a 0, we're going to break out of that little loop body. And this would be the loop body right here. And we do this over and over. And as soon as we got the 0, we'd go and we'd hit the last line, which is next, and it would be the average. So we can also do things like we can do loops that are summing. So in this example, we start with the sum equals 0 before we enter the loop. Then our loop itself, we're going to loop over inputted numbers. And again, the 0 will cause the loop body to quit executing. So that's our sentinel value there, the 0. So then what we go in there and we do is we say sum equals the sum plus the number that was just input. Then we go back up again, we loop up. So it's just a one-line body here, a loop body. So it just goes over here, it adds it. Then we go up there and we say, okay, give us another number. If it's 0, then we exit out and we hit the next line, which we don't have a line here, but I imagine we'd have a line like print the sum just to let the user know what the sum is. So this is a very simple one. The next one, we can do something like counting negative numbers. There was an example in zyBooks dealing with that. So what we can do is we start with the count equals 0, and then we can start looping over, asking the user to input a number. And if they enter a 0, it'll cause the program to exit. So every time we input the number, we'll take that number, we'll look at it, we'll say, is the number less than 0? If it is, then it's a negative number. So our count of negative numbers would increase by 1. So we'd say count equals count plus 1. And then we go back up, we'd ask for another number. And if that number was 0, we would exit out, go to the next line. If it wasn't, we'd come back over here, we'd evaluate and say, is that number negative? If so, then we increase count by 1. Otherwise, we go back and ask for another number. So this process repeats over and over until it gets the 0. And the 0, again, as I mentioned before, is what we call the sentinel value. It's the value that it checks to see if we're going to kick out or not. So again, over here, we'd probably do like a print of the count after we get out of it. And that would be like the next line after the loop body. And then the last example that they give is for finding the max value. So we'd start by saying max equals 0. Then we would have that loop body where we ask for the inputted numbers. And again, we're going to use the number 0 as our sentinel value to exit. And then we just loop over the statement. If the input number is greater than the max that we already have, then the max is going to be this new number. So for example, if our previous max, well, here our max is 0. We ask them for a number. If that number is 3, then 3 is greater than 0. So our new max number is going to be that number that we just took from the 3. Then we'd loop back up. We'd say, hey, give me another number. And if they don't give us a 0, then we take that number and we compare it and say, hey, is that new number, let's say it's a 7. Is that 7 greater than the 3 we just got? Yes, it is. Well, then our max is that new number. So we just loop over this thing over and over until we hit, again, what we call the sentinel value, which is a 0. If we get that 0, then it'll kick us out and we'll go to this next line here. In this next line, we'd probably do something like print out the max value that we found. So that's how looping generally works in pseudocode, and it's not really that big a leap to get from pseudocode here into our actual Python structures. So we'll go over that in one of our next videos. So stay tuned.